My official clapback, to the gold bugs and silver bugs and inflationistas is I know you think that you saw all this coming, all of you, y'all. You think you saw it coming and everything, right? Grocery prices are up. Inflation since COVID hit is about 25% now, and everything. At least that wasn't year over year. That's everything that's come since, the COVID crisis. COVID-19 crisis basically, got hit and everything, and that, impacted, but what you're not seeing and what so many of you that are basically saying more inflation and you've got all this negativity and you're thinking, oh god, it's just going to keep going ever there's more and more inflation and everything, and that's I've made the right bet by buying gold and everything, and you're probably feeling pretty smug right now and whatnot. But what you're not seeing at the end of the day is that many of our fellow countrymen and women financed that 25% rise in prices by putting it on their credit cards, right? Like, and that's problematic because the way that credit functions is like it's treated by America like conceptually as though credit is like this big thing that has a massive stimulus benefit for the U.S. economy, but that's not true. Like you're borrowing against the future, basically, which means that you're buying now and you're gonna have to pay for it later. Paying for it later. That means that you're not spending that money buying goods and services because you're paying for the debt that you owe. So, if the economy were metaphorically a series of gears, then credit is not oil. It's not oil, it's molasses. So it makes the gears run faster for a little while until it hardens and then it congeals into such a way where it gums up the gears and somebody has to come in and spray something on it to make the stuff to break down the molasses and get it off, and everything. And uh a chemical engineer. And so, the thing about all this is that, that our irresponsible American countrymen, or the fiscal irresponsibility was that these people went grocery shopping and all that other stuff and financed their grocery runs on credit cards. And so while you're feeling smug about your gold, silver, and Bitcoin investments, you need to understand that a credit bubble is opening up all over again. Like we never learn, as a country or as a species of Americans. I mean, you learn when something goes wrong at 2007, the lesson doesn't get absorbed. We just do the same fucking shit over and over and over again. History repeats. And I mean, the whole problem is that like I was trying to indicate, you have an Irving Fisher debt deflation style crisis unfolding. I mean, everybody right now, the popular view is that, we're in the middle of a stagflationary scenario, and that because that's the most recent memory. It's the 1978, uh, oil shock that this country went through, and that's the conditions that people most think resembles, and is the most popular opinion here on YouTube. And yet, the reality is that modern America more closely resembles 1920s America than it ever has 1978 or whatever year the oil shock was in. It looks era just prior to this one of easy credit, that fueled out, corporations borrowing tons and tons of money and everything. Easy to get a loan, and a lot of people got loans irresponsibly and everything. And same shit. all over again. And I had to get wiser, because I used to think that when I saw somebody wearing, luxury clothing, and when they had all this property and all this stuff, and they were, a huge, like, when I saw that flex, like, I had an ex-girlfriend at one point who, had an RV and a bunch of, like, she was going around doing all these events and, going places, and, well connected. It kind of seemed like, and she was going around and about and everything, and she was it kind of seemed like her family had money and they had all this inheritance coming in her direction and everything. And so, it was like, I was dating somebody that kind of seemed a little bit more like of a higher economic socioeconomic class than me, and I made the mistake of trusting my instinct there and pointing that out. I mean, it was like, you seem kind of like rich compared to me and everything, only to find out that my own, fiscal house was in better order than hers, because, kind of, we've had our struggles with debt. We've always paid ours off eventually, and yet her family was basically drowning in debt. And we were you were there was this thing that was happening, where and that's one of the problems that we have in the modern ecosystem. I mean, if you see someone running around in designer clothes, you think that person's wealthy because they've got designer clothes on. But the reality is that the designer clothes brands will target people that are of low income on purpose, because they know these people are desperate to kind of look and come across as if, they have serious money and everything. And so you have the fake rich problem, that is all over the place and everything. But anyways, the frustration is that, America and the financial conditions that it's in more closely resemble 1920 than they do, 1927 or so, than they do like 1978. And yet the most popular opinion is that, we're heading into a that stagflation is happening again. And I think, you know when the Great Depression hit, and everything, what happened in a big way was that all that easy credit started, coming due, you know, so to speak, and that, caused a whole chain of events to, cascade as a result. What I see is the crisis isn't here. We're not at a crisis point yet, but what I see is, I would describe it as like there's a battle, you know, happening on the stage of the economy between two fundamental forces, which is inflation and deflation, right? And everything. And so far, the Federal Reserve has been able to conquer deflation, and but what it did was like basically coming in and just, you know, flooding the market with liquidity until the deflation was basically pushed under and everything. But it didn't solve the fundamental conditions that created the instability and everything, and that created that instability that led to that deflation in the first place. So there's been a lot of irresponsible borrowing, and if this sounds familiar, we went through this in 2007. There's been a lot of that going on and everything, and at some point that credit is going to come, the creditors are going to get sick of this and calling the bill, so to speak. And what really scares me is that, like I said, I mean, we're looking at a credit bubble, man. I mean, like, the debt levels have only gone up, 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 and up, and at some point it's only going to take a certain amount of people deciding that they're not going to pay before it becomes, a a systematic risk, as they refer to it. Like, yeah, we're not at the deflationary scenario yet, but debt is, high debt levels are the fuel that feeds the deflationary reaper of doom, death, and gloom.